Many asked why the treaty was signed. They wondered why the great Tarkin Empire surrendered to a species of hairless, soft-skinned bipeds who hadn't even mastered plasma shielding. The critics thought humanity weak because they bled red and their bones broke under heavy gravity. But those critics hadn't seen them in the dirt. They hadn't heard the sound of human artillery tearing the sky, or watched a human with half his face blown off smile and pull a pin from a high-explosive grenade. Kaler had. Before the armistice, Kaler served as a sub-commander in the 4th Tarkin Infantry, an expeditionary force tasked with the subjugation of fringe worlds. The Tarkin biology was designed for conquest. They stood 8 feet tall, their skin armored with naturally occurring silicate plating, and their nervous systems highly regulated to prevent the disruption of pain. When they went to war, they did so with the cold, calculated precision of an apex predator culling the herd. They did not feel fear. They did not panic. They executed, or at least that was what they believed. The campaign began on a human agricultural colony known as New Odessa. It was a dusty, insignificant rock in the Epsilon Eridani sector, valued only for its atmospheric processors and vast fields of genetically modified grain. The Tarkan fleet jumped into the system, bypassing rudimentary orbital defense satellites with their stealth drives. Commander Virn Kalar's superior stood on the bridge of the dreadnought, observing the blue and brown sphere below. He had reviewed the biological profiles of the human species and scoffed. "They are made of water and calcium," Virn had said, his mandibles clicking in amusement. "No natural armor, no redundant organs, a thermal threshold that is pitifully narrow. Their weaponry relies on chemical combustion to propel physical slugs. It is barbaric. This will not be a war, Kalar. It will be pest control." The Tarkans dropped onto the planet's surface at dawn, utilizing grav pods that slammed into the soil with earth-shattering force. Their target was the primary colony hub, defended by a small detachment of the United Earth Alliance's 104th Infantry Regiment. They expected the humans to surrender the moment towering mechs and armored infantry breached their perimeter. They expected them to break. Kalar's forces marched through the outer agrarian sectors, their plasma rifles turning crop yields to ash. The air smelled of burning vegetation and ozone. For the first 2 hours, there was silence. The humans had retreated into the industrial complex, a sprawling labyrinth of steel pipes, processing vats, and concrete bunkers. "They hide," Virn relayed over the comms network, his tone dripping with disdain. "Flush them out." Kaler led his platoon into the main plaza of Sector 4. It was eerily quiet. His thermal optics scanned the structures, but the humans had somehow masked their heat signatures. That was their first mistake, underestimating human ingenuity. The Tarkans assumed a lack of technological elegance meant a lack of tactical sophistication. The silence was shattered by a sound Kalar had never heard before. A sharp mechanical crack followed instantly by a deafening roar. To Kalar's left, a Tarkin shock trooper, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, whose silicate armor could withstand a glancing blow from a light plasma cannon, simply ceased to exist from the waist up. He collapsed dark blue blood, spraying across the dusty Duracrete. Panic and emotion entirely foreign to Tarkin physiology flickered in the back of Kalar's mind. "Sniper!" one of his scouts hissed, pointing toward a rusted water tower nearly a mile away. Before they could adjust their optics, the world erupted. The humans hadn't fled. They had drawn the infantry into a kill zone. From every window, every rooftop, and every storm drain muzzle, flashes strobed like dying stars. They weren't using energy weapons that dissipated over distance or gave away their positions with bright glowing beams. They were using kinetic rifles weapons that hurled solid metal at supersonic speeds. The Tarkans returned fire plasma bolts melting through the concrete barricades the humans had erected. But it didn't stop them. Kaler watched through his scope as a human soldier, identified later in captured logs as Private Jackson Cole, took a glancing plasma burn to his shoulder. It should have incapacitated him. The extreme heat flash-boiled the fluids in his arm, searing through muscle and bone. By all biological laws, the shock should have caused his nervous system to shut down. Tarkan physiology demanded torpor when critically injured to preserve life. Instead, Cole screamed. Not in terror, but in absolute unadulterated rage. He didn't drop his weapon. He didn't retreat. With his dominant arm hanging uselessly at his side, he braced his heavy machine gun against a concrete pylon with his good arm and his knee, and he laid down a suppressing fire so thick it chewed through the silicate plating of 3 Tarkan soldiers, turning them to shredded meat. Kaler watched horrified as a creature made of soft tissue and fragile bone weaponized its own agony. The expeditionary force had come to exterminate a lesser species, but as the dirt of New Odessa ran blue with Tarkan blood, Kaler realized with a creeping dread that they had kicked the nest of something entirely different. They had provoked the demons of the dirt. By the 3rd cycle of the invasion, the pest control operation had devolved into a meat grinder. The Tarkans had taken the outer sectors, but the cost was staggering. Commander Viren refused to acknowledge the reality of the situation, attributing their losses to bad luck and structural anomalies rather than the capability of the human forces. But Kalar was on the ground. He saw the truth. It wasn't just their weapons that were terrifying. It was their biology. The infantry captured a human medical outpost on the outskirts of the industrial zone. Inside, they found bodies both human and Tarkan, alongside human medical supplies. Field surgeons examined the chemicals the humans used on themselves. When they presented their findings, the entire command structure was thrown into profound disbelief. They are poisoning themselves. The chief medical officer, a brilliant intellect named Zorath, explained, holding up a small auto-injecting syringe filled with a clear liquid. This is a synthetic analog of a hormone they produce naturally, epinephrine, adrenaline. What does it do? Kalar asked, looking at the crude plastic tube. It overrides their biological safety limiters. Zorath said, his voice trembling slightly. In our species, pain is a command to stop. It forces the body to rest and repair. But humans, their brains secrete this chemical to ignore pain entirely. It increases their heart rate to dangerous levels, shunts blood away from non-essential organs, and pushes their muscles past the point of mechanical failure. They can literally tear their own ligaments from the bone by exerting too much force, and they won't even feel it until the chemical wears off. They invoke temporary insanity to survive. Kalar didn't fully comprehend the terrifying implications of this until the siege of Sector 7. His platoon had pushed a small human detachment into a crumbling refinery. The humans were cut off out of food and running low on ammunition. Kalar was ordered to clear the building. They breached the heavy steel doors and moved through the dark, damp corridors, thermal optics cutting through the gloom. They cornered a squad of humans in a loading bay. There were 5 humans, The Tarkans numbered 20. Kalar ordered them to surrender in their own language. "Lay down your arms. You are surrounded. Submission guarantees survival." The human in charge, a man wearing the insignia of a sergeant, stepped forward. His armor was cracked, his face was smeared with soot and dried red blood, and he was limping heavily. The name taped to his chest plate read, Miller. Sergeant David Miller. He looked at Kalar, an 8-foot-tall armored alien, aiming a plasma cannon at his chest. Miller didn't tremble. He didn't cower. He spat a wad of blood onto the floor, reached to his tactical webbing, and pulled out one of those clear syringes. He jammed it directly into his thigh, right through the fabric of his trousers. Kalar watched the human's pupils dilate until his eyes were almost entirely black. His breathing became ragged, like a starving predator. "Fix bayonets." Miller snarled, his voice a gravelly bark that echoed off the metal walls. To Kalar's absolute horror, the 4 soldiers behind him didn't hesitate. They attached jagged 12-inch steel blades to the ends of their rifles. They had run out of kinetic ammunition. They were going to fight their armored aggressors with knives. "Fire!" Kalar yelled, suddenly terrified by the sheer irrationality of what he was witnessing. Plasma bolts illuminated the room. 2 of the humans were vaporized instantly, but Miller and the other 2 charged. They didn't run away from the blinding superheated death. They sprinted directly into it. A plasma round caught Miller in the side, blowing a hole the size of a fist through his abdomen. The heat cauterized the wound instantly, but the kinetic force should have thrown him backward and incapacitated him. Instead, the momentum barely slowed him down. The adrenaline in his system, that biological madness, kept him on his feet. He closed the distance before the Tarkin gunner could acquire a second lock. Miller leaped, driving his bayonet upward, bypassing the thick silicate armor on the gunner's chest and finding the softer tissue under the jaw. The blade sank deep, and the warrior fell choking on his own blood. Miller wrenched the blade free, turning his wild blackened eyes toward Kalar. The human was dying. Half of his internal organs were charred. His body was shutting down, but his brain refused to let him die until he had taken the sub-commander with him. Kalar fired blindly, the plasma bolt searing the side of Miller's face, taking off his ear and scorching his skull. He stumbled, falling to his knees. Kalar thought it was over. He lowered his weapon, breathing heavily, trying to process the sheer violence of the encounter. But Miller didn't fall forward. He looked up at Kalar, half his face a charred ruin, and he smiled. It was a horrific blood-stained grimace. "See you in hell," he whispered. He hadn't dropped his left hand. In it, he held a small green metallic sphere. He had pulled the pin the moment he charged. "Grenade!" Kalar roared, throwing himself backward behind a steel pillar. The explosion rocked the loading bay, sending shrapnel tearing through the air. The blast killed Miller and 2 more Tarkin soldiers. When the smoke cleared, Kalar stood up, ears ringing, staring at the cratered floor where the human sergeant had knelt. They had won the skirmish. But as Kalar looked at the shattered remains of his squad, he realized they were losing the war. An army cannot defeat an enemy that weaponizes its own death. They could not break the spirit of a creature that viewed its own destruction as a tactical advantage. Commander Verne had called the humans fragile. But what was armor compared to a species that refused to die when it was killed? The sun finally set on New Odessa, plunging the war-torn industrial complex into a deep, freezing night. Tarkin vision was vastly superior in low-light conditions. Their eyes shifted to the infrared spectrum, naturally allowing them to hunt in total darkness. Night had always been their greatest ally. On 100 worlds, they had waited for the dark to slaughter their enemies in their sleep. The humans, being diurnal creatures with poor night vision, should have been paralyzed. They should have huddled in their bunkers, praying for the dawn. Instead, they turned the dark into a weapon. Following the disaster in the refinery, Kalar's depleted platoon was reassigned to hold the line at an old hydroelectric dam overlooking Sector 4. Commander Verne was growing impatient. He ordered a massive mechanized push for the morning, intent on wiping out the remaining human resistance in a single overwhelming strike. Kalar's job was to secure the high ground and prevent any human flanking maneuvers during the night. The platoon fortified the concrete ridges of the dam. Kalar posted sentries and established overlapping fields of fire. The darkness was absolute, thick with the smell of wet earth and copper. At 0200 hours, the atmospheric processors above the colony initiated a purge cycle, sending a thick, freezing fog rolling down the valley. The moisture in the air began to scatter Tarkin infrared optics. The clear, glowing heat signatures they relied upon became blurry, ghost-like smudges. Sub-Commander Kalar's lead sentry whispered over the comms. "I have movement. Grid Alpha 6. Kalar peered through the fog. He saw nothing but the swirling mist. Infrared. Negative. Too much thermal interference from the fog and the water runoff. But I heard something. Metal on stone. Kalar signaled the squad to ready their weapons. They waited. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rushing water of the dam below. Then out of the darkness, a voice echoed. It didn't come from the valley. It came from their own tactical frequency. The humans had sliced into the encrypted comms. "Tarkin Elements, this is Captain Sarah Jenkins of the United Earth Alliance. You are currently trespassing on private property. Consider this your final eviction notice." Before Kalar could order a trace on the signal, the sky above them tore open. It wasn't plasma fire. It was a sound like tearing canvas, a high-pitched shrieking whistle that grew exponentially louder in a fraction of a second. Kalar had never experienced artillery bombardment before. The Tarkins considered indirect unguided fire to be archaic and inefficient. Why lob explosives blindly when one could strike with pinpoint orbital lasers? But orbital lasers could be detected. They could be shielded against. Artillery-dumb, brutal kinetic artillery was a primal force of nature. The first shell impacted 50 yards to Kalar's left, obliterating a rocky outcropping and sending a shockwave that threw him to the ground. The sound was so loud it bypassed his auditory sensors and vibrated directly through his skeletal structure. Then came the second shell, then the third. The humans weren't targeting precise locations. They were systematically erasing the entire grid square. "Take cover," Kalar roared, diving into a shallow drainage trench. The bombardment lasted for 3 agonizing minutes. The earth shook violently, the concussive force turning the air into a physical weapon. The soldiers, the proud warriors of the Tarkin Empire, were reduced to cowering in the mud, clutching their helmets as the world exploded around them. When the shelling finally stopped, a ringing silence descended. The fog was now mixed with choking dust and the smell of cordite. Kalar slowly raised his head over the edge of the trench. Half of his platoon was gone, buried under tons of collapsed concrete or ripped apart by shrapnel. "Report!" Kaler yelled. "Sound off!" Before anyone could answer, the fog in front of them began to move. The humans hadn't just shelled the dam. They had used the bombardment as cover to advance up the steep, muddy incline. They had crept up the slope while the explosives were falling, placing themselves perilously close to their own shrapnel, a tactic they called danger close. It was suicidal. It was madness. And it worked perfectly. Figures emerged from the dust entirely covered in mud to mask their thermal signatures. They didn't yell. They didn't charge blindly. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity. At the head of the formation was a human officer holding a kinetic assault rifle. Kalar assumed this was Captain Sarah Jenkins. Beside her was a towering soldier carrying a heavy rotary cannon, a man identified later as Corporal Thomas "Tommy" Reed. They didn't give the Tarkans time to recover from the shock. They opened fire at point-blank range. The engagement was brutal and intimate. Plasma bolts and lead slugs crossed paths in the dark. Kaler watched a Tarkan warrior lunge at a human only to have his knee shattered by a shotgun blast from a medic, a human wearing a red cross on his helmet, later known to be Private First Class Michael O'Connor. O'Connor didn't even flinch as the Tarkan fell. He simply stepped over the massive alien body and fired a flare directly into the chest of another attacker. The flare ignited, burning at thousands of degrees, illuminating the battlefield in a hellish, sputtering red light. The red glare revealed the true horror of the situation. The humans were vastly outnumbered by the reinforcements holding the lower valley, but Jenkins hadn't come to take the dam. She had come to trap them on it. "Commander Vierne!" Kalar screamed into the comms, ducking a hail of kinetic rounds that sparked off the concrete above his head. "We are being overrun at the dam, requesting immediate orbital support," Static hissed back at him. Then Vierne's voice strained and panicked. "Negative, Sub-Commander. We cannot provide support. The humans, they bypassed the front line. They are in the valley." What? Kaler stared down at the valley below, where the main Tarkan encampment was situated. Through the clearing fog, he saw it. The humans hadn't just attacked the dam. Jenkins had led a secondary stealth force under the command of Lieutenant James Mitchell through the flooded drainage tunnels beneath the valley. While the Tarkans were looking up at the artillery, Mitchell's forces had emerged directly in the center of the command camp. They didn't try to fight the mechs. They didn't try to engage the heavy infantry. Mitchell's squad had made a beeline for the anti-orbital battery generators and planted high explosive charges. Down in the valley, a series of massive chain detonations lit up the night. The anti-orbital batteries, the Empire's only defense against the human fleet in high orbit, went dark. Kalar looked back at Captain Jenkins. She was bleeding from a shrapnel wound on her cheek, her uniform soaked in mud and rain. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking up at the sky. Through the gap in the clouds, the stars seemed to blink, but they weren't stars. They were the thruster burns of United Earth Alliance dropships descending rapidly through the atmosphere now that the air defenses were disabled. Jenkins had used her own squad as bait. She had orchestrated an artillery strike on herself, fought up a fortified hill in the dark, and initiated close-quarters combat with a biologically superior enemy, all to distract the Tarkans from the fact that they were already dead. As the first human dropship screamed overhead unleashing a torrent of heavy cannon fire into the Tarkin encampment below. Kalar dropped his weapon. He fell to his knees in the mud. For the first time in his life, Kalar understood the concept of fear. Not just the biological instinct to survive, but a profound existential terror. They had come to conquer a species of soft-skinned farmers. Instead, they found a race of apex predators who had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other, and who were more than happy to apply those lessons to the stars. The valley was lost. In the span of a single planetary rotation, the expeditionary force of the Tarkin Empire had been reduced from a mechanized army of conquest to a fractured fleeing remnant. Kalar rallied the survivors of the dam 30 exhausted, battered warriors out of a platoon of 80 and ordered a full retreat to the Axiom, the grounded heavy cruiser that served as the planetary command center. The trek through the mud and burning wreckage of their own dropships was a march of the damned. They were hunted every step of the way. This was when Kalar discovered another terrifying facet of human biology. Tarkins were sprinters. Their silicate plating and dense musculature made them devastating in short, overwhelming engagements, but their bodies overheated quickly. They required deep, regulated periods of torpor to flush lactic acid and reset their nervous systems. The humans the Tarkins learned to their absolute horror were persistence hunters. They did not tire. They did not stop. A squad of United Earth Alliance Rangers led by a tracker named Staff Sergeant William Bradley shadowed them through the dense, burning agricultural forests. They didn't engage the platoon in direct firefights. They simply bled them. Every time the Tarkins stopped to rest, every time Kalar's men entered the preliminary stages of torpor, a high-velocity kinetic round would shatter the silence, taking the head off a sentry. By the time they reached the reinforced airlocks of the Axiom, Kalar's men were hallucinating from thermal exhaustion and sleep deprivation. Commander Viren had sealed the ship, fortifying the massive durasteel hull against the inevitable siege. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the stench of ozone copper and fear. Viren stood at the hollow table in the bridge, his silicate armor chipped and his mandibles twitching erratically. He was reviewing the tactical data, trying to comprehend how an agrarian militia, reinforced by a single infantry regiment, had dismantled his vanguard. "Sub-Commander Kalar," Vern hissed as Kalar entered the bridge, his armor scorched and slick with mud. "Explain to me how they are doing this. Their technology is primitive. Their biology is fragile. Yet the casualty reports are anomalous." Kalar approached the console and input his command codes, bringing up a localized tactical summary he had compiled during the retreat. Viren stared at the holographic text, his eyes narrowing in denial. "This reads like a myth, Kalar. You are describing monsters, not a civilized species." "They are not civilized when you push them into the dirt, Commander," Kalar replied, his voice devoid of the deferential tone he once used. "They are predators who learn to wear uniforms, and they are outside." The siege of the Axiom began not with a bombardment, but with silence. For 12 hours, the humans simply surrounded the grounded cruiser. They dug trenches. They established overlapping kill zones. They set up heavy artillery batteries out of range of the remaining point defense cannons. Then the psychological warfare began. At precisely 0300 hours, a series of massive directional speakers were deployed along the human trench lines. They didn't broadcast demands for surrender. They broadcasted a continuous high-decibel loop of the exact frequencies that caused severe equilibrium disruption in the Tarkin auditory cortex. It was a shrieking metallic grind overlaid with the rhythmic thumping cadence of what Kaler later learned was human heavy metal music. The noise penetrated the thick hull of the cruiser. It rattled their teeth. It made it impossible to sleep, impossible to think, and impossible to communicate without shouting. "Make it stop!" one of the comms officers screamed, clawing at the sides of his helmet. "Target their speakers." "They are shifting them randomly. We can't get a lock," another technician yelled back. For 3 days, the Tarkins were trapped in a vibrating metal tomb. The humans were systematically dismantling their sanity. When a squad of Tarkin shock troopers, driven mad by the noise and the confinement, defied Vern's orders and opened an airlock to charge the human lines, they were cut down in seconds by a single human sniper. Kaler watched the surveillance feed as the sniper specialist Daniel Cross methodically eliminated the panicked Tarkins. He didn't aim for center mass. He shot them in the knee joints, shattering their mobility, and then left them bleeding in the mud. He was using them as bait. When medical teams tried to deploy energy shields to retrieve the wounded Cross-shot the shield generators out of their hands, he let the Tarkins scream for hours, their agony broadcasting over the open comms, further breaking the morale of everyone inside the ship. The humans were not just trying to kill them. They were trying to show them that they were no longer the apex predators of the galaxy. The Tarkins were trapped in a cage, and humanity was poking them through the bars. On the 4th day of the siege, the shrieking music abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It rang in their ears, thick with an impending dread. Kaler gripped his plasma rifle, standing guard in the secondary access corridor near the ship's reactor core. His muscles ached from lack of torpor, his vision swimming with exhaustion. All hands. Vern's voice crackled over the internal PA system. He sounded hollow, his arrogant edge completely worn away by the reality of their demise. "They have breached the outer hull. Sections 4, 7, and 9 are compromised. Defend the core." The humans hadn't used plasma cutters or heavy lasers to breach the hull. They had crawled through the mud under the cover of the deafening noise, manually attached shaped thermite charges to the ship's weakest structural points, and blown the bulkheads inward. The fighting inside the Axiom was completely alien to Tarkin doctrine. Their weapons were designed for open fields and long sightlines. The humans, however, seemed to thrive in the claustrophobic smoke-filled corridors of a dying ship. They employed a terrifying tool they called a shotgun, a kinetic weapon that didn't fire a single projectile but a cloud of dense metal pellets. In the tight hallways of the cruiser, it was devastating. One didn't even need to aim. Simply pulling the trigger allowed the sheer kinetic force to strip a Tarkin of his silicate armor and turn his internal organs to pulp. Kaler heard them coming before he saw them. The heavy rhythmic thud of combat boots on metal grating, accompanied by short, sharp barks of human communication. "Clear right!" Pushing forward, watch the corners. "Frag out!" A small, cylindrical object bounced around the corner and rolled to a stop at Kalar's feet. Remembering the sacrifice of Sergeant Miller in the refinery, Kalar braced for a lethal explosion, diving behind a heavy bulkhead door. But it wasn't a fragmentation grenade. It was a flashbang. The detonation was a sensory cataclysm, a blinding white light magnitudes brighter than Tarkin optical nerves could process, accompanied by a concussive boom that instantly ruptured his tympanic membranes. Kalar's superior vision and hearing the very traits that made him a deadly hunter were instantly turned into his greatest vulnerabilities. Kalar collapsed to the floor blind deaf and completely disoriented. His nervous system panicked, attempting to force him into emergency torpor, but the residual adrenaline from the combat kept him violently awake. Strong hands grabbed his armor. He was hauled to his knees. As his vision slowly returned, swimming with dark spots and burning after images, Kalar found himself staring down the barrel of a kinetic assault rifle. The human holding it was clad in heavy scarred body armor. A tactical helmet obscured her face, but the insignia on her shoulder designated her as an officer, Lieutenant Abigail Foster. Flanking her was a massive human holding one of the terrifying shotguns, Sergeant Gregory Hale. Kalar waited for the execution. He had ordered the deaths of hundreds of their kind. By the laws of the Tarkin Empire, the weak were culled by the strong. But Foster didn't fire. She lowered her rifle slightly, keeping the barrel trained on Kalar's chest, and tapped the side of her helmet, switching her external speakers to the Tarkin dialect. "Throw your weapon away," Foster commanded, her voice distorted by the electronic synthesizer. "Do it now, and you live." Kalar hesitated. "Why," he managed to croak out, his throat dry. "You have won. Terminate me." Sergeant Hale let out a low chuckle, speaking in his native tongue. Kalar had his internal translator active, and the words chilled him. "Tell ET here we ain't in the business of doing their paperwork for 'em. Besides, dead guys can't carry out the wounded." Foster ignored him, keeping her eyes locked on Kalar. "We don't execute prisoners of war. Drop the rifle." Kalar slowly uncurled his fingers, letting his plasma rifle clatter against the metal deck. "Secure him," Foster ordered. Hale stepped forward, slapping a heavy pair of magnetic binders onto Kalar's wrists. Before they could move him, the ship's internal alarms began to blare with a deafening rhythmic klaxon. The lighting shifted from standard blue to emergency crimson. "Warning," the ship's automated voice announced calmly. "Reactor core overload initiated. Containment failure in T-4 minutes. Authorization, Commander Vern." Kalar's blood turned to ice. Vern, the coward. Rather than face the humiliation of surrender, rather than answer to the Tarkin High Council for losing a fleet to a pre-stellar species, he was going to scuttle the ship. He was going to turn the Axiom into a thermonuclear bomb, vaporizing himself, the human boarding parties, and every surviving member of his own crew within a 10-mile radius. "What is that?" Foster demanded, seeing the panic spread across Kalar's face. The commander, Kalar, gasped. "He has initiated a core breach. He intends to destroy the ship and everything around it." Foster didn't panic. She didn't freeze. She immediately tapped her comms. "Command, this is Strike Team Alpha. Be advised the enemy has initiated a self-destruct sequence. Reactor overload. Estimate 4 minutes to critical mass." Static hissed back. "Copy Alpha. Pull your team out. Evacuate immediately." "Negative command," Foster replied coldly. "If this thing blows, it'll take out the FOB, the medical tents, and half the valley. We can't outrun the blast radius." "Lieutenant, what is your intention?" "We're going to stop it." Foster cut the channel and grabbed Kalar by the armor, plating on his chest, hauling him to his feet with surprising strength. "Where is he? Where is the commander?" "The bridge," Kalar stammered. "But the blast doors will be sealed. You cannot breach them in time. Watch me." Hale grunted, racking a fresh shell into his shotgun. They dragged Kalar with them as they sprinted through the crimson-lit corridors. They passed the bodies of Tarkan and human alike, the gruesome tapestry of close-quarters slaughter. When they reached the massive durasteel blast doors of the bridge, the doors were, as Kalar predicted, sealed tight. "Thermite?" Hale asked, dropping his pack. "Too slow." Foster said, her eyes frantically scanning the bulkhead. She grabbed Kalar again. "You're a sub-commander. Do you have an emergency override?" "It requires a dual authorization biometric scan," Kalar explained. "My handprint and a retinal scan from a senior engineering officer. We don't have one." Foster looked at Hale. Hale looked down the corridor toward a pile of Tarkan casualties. Without a word, he sprinted over to the bodies. Kalar watched in horrified fascination as Hale rummaged through the dead, finding an engineering officer identifiable by his orange shoulder plating. Hale didn't hesitate. He drew a heavy combat knife, grabbed the dead officer by the helmet, and cleanly excised the alien's right eye. He jogged back, wiping the blue blood off his gloves, and held the gruesome prize up to the retinal scanner. "Hand!" he ordered Kalar. Trembling Kalar placed his hand on the biometric pad. Hale held the severed eye to the optical lens. The console beeped a cheerful green. The heavy hydraulic locks disengaged with a hiss, and the blast doors slid open. Inside the bridge, Commander Viren stood before the main console, his hands resting on the manual override levers. When he saw them, 2 humans and a captive sub-commander, his mandibles flared in furious defiance. "Traitors!" Viren spat, drawing his ceremonial plasma pistol. "You will die with the Empire." He didn't get to aim. Specialist Samuel Norton, the 3rd member of Foster's fire team, who had been covering their rear, stepped into the doorway and fired a single 3-round burst from his kinetic rifle. The bullets took Vern in the dominant shoulder and the thigh. The impact spun the towering commander around, throwing him violently to the deck. His pistol skittered across the floor. Foster and Hale were already at the console. "Cancel the overload!" Foster yelled at Kalar. Kalar rushed forward. He didn't care about the Empire anymore. He didn't care about the chain of command. He wanted to live. His fingers flew across the Tarkan interface, overriding Vern's commands, venting the excess plasma into the exterior heat sinks, and slamming the dampening rods back into the core. The crimson emergency lights flickered, held for a terrifying second, and then shifted back to standard blue. The klaxons died away. Kalar slumped against the console, gasping for air. On the floor, Commander Viren was bleeding profusely, clutching his shattered leg. He looked up at Lieutenant Foster, his eyes filled with absolute venomous hatred. "You think you have won," Viren hissed, coughing up a spatter of blue blood. "You are savages. You use dirt and mud and cruel weapons. You have no honor." Foster stood over him. She looked at the blood on the deck, looked at her own wounded men, and then looked down at the architect of this planetary slaughter. She unclipped a small pouch from her tactical webbing. Kalar braced himself, expecting her to pull out a knife to finish the commander off, or a sidearm to execute him where he lay. Instead, she pulled out a white sterile bandage and a canister of biofoam. "Hold him down," Foster ordered Hale. Hale pinned the struggling, towering alien to the deck. Foster knelt beside the creature who had ordered the extermination of her people, and with quick, practiced efficiency, She began to pack his wounds, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. "What are you doing?" Viren choked out, utterly baffled. "Let me die." Foster finished securing the bandage and stood up, looking down at the defeated commander with a gaze colder than deep space. "No," Foster said quietly. "You don't get the easy way out. You're going to live, Commander. You're going to sit in a cell, you're going to face a tribunal, and you are going to spend the rest of your unnaturally long life remembering the day you got your ass kicked by a bunch of farmers." She turned away from him and tapped her comms. "Command, this is Alpha. The core is secure. The HVT is incapacitated and receiving medical attention. Send the prisoner transport details." Kaler stood against the console, his wrists bound, watching the humans administer aid to the monster who tried to vaporize them. In that moment, the true horrifying reality of humanity finally clicked into place for the sub-commander. They weren't terrifying because they were brutal. The universe was full of brutal species. The Tarkin Empire was built on brutality. The humans were terrifying because they possessed a duality that defied logic. They could bomb their own positions, charge into plasma fire with bayonets, and tear a ship apart with shotguns and thermite. They could fight with a savagery that made apex predators look like prey. But when the shooting stopped, they could put away the monsters they had become. They could bandage their enemies. They could show mercy to those who showed them none. A species that fought without restraint was dangerous. But a species that could turn its savagery on and off like a switch. A species that chose to be humane only after it had utterly destroyed its foe. That was a species that would conquer the stars. The days following the fall of the Axiom dismantled everything Kaler thought he knew about the universe. In the Tarkin Empire, to be taken prisoner was a fate worse than death. It signified a complete stripping of honor. Tarkin POWs were typically subjected to brutal labor starvation or public execution to demoralize the remaining enemy forces. When Kylar was marched out of the grounded cruiser in magnetic binders alongside hundreds of his surviving brethren, he prepared himself for the end. He expected firing squads. He expected to be marched into the toxic sumps of the industrial sector and buried alive. Instead, they led the captives to the human triage center. The humans had established a sprawling medical camp in the shadow of the very dam where Kalar's platoon had been decimated. The efficiency of it was staggering. For a species that fought with such chaotic, explosive fury, their post-battle logistics were a symphony of organized calm. They did not separate the wounded by species. This was the first detail that broke Kalar's understanding of their hierarchy. He sat on a metal bench, his hands still bound, and watched as a human doctor, a weary-looking woman whose name tag read Dr. Evelyn Reed, moved down a line of cots. On one cot lay a human soldier missing his lower leg, his face pale from blood loss. On the very next cot lay a Tarkin heavy gunner, his silicate armor cracked open, exposing severely burned tissue from a localized plasma backfire. Dr. Reed did not prioritize her own species. She prioritized the severity of the wounds. Kaler watched in stunned silence as human medics synthesized a crude but effective saline analog to flush the Tarkin gunner's wounds, injecting him with localized anesthetics before meticulously picking the shrapnel from his flesh. "Why?" Kaler asked aloud, not expecting an answer. "Because the shooting stopped," a voice replied. Kaler turned to see a human officer standing nearby. He wore a crisp, unsoiled uniform that starkly contrasted with the mud-caked armor of the frontline infantry. His insignia designated him as a major. His name was Richard Dalton. He held an electronic tablet observing the triage tent with a quiet intensity. In our history, we spent thousands of years slaughtering each other over land resources and ideology, Major Dalton said, speaking the Tarkin language with a heavy clipped accent. We perfected the art of killing, but we also learned that if you do not know how to stop killing, if you cannot rebuild what you have broken and heal those you have conquered, you do not win a war. You just inherit a graveyard. He gestured to the rows of wounded. Your Commander Viren ordered the execution of our civilians in Sector 2. My men found the mass graves yesterday. By all rights, my infantrymen want to line you all up against a wall and pull the trigger. It takes every ounce of our discipline not to do that. But we are a civilized species, Sub-Commander Kalar. And civilization means carrying the burden of mercy, even when it is heavy. Kalar looked at Major Dalton. You call yourselves civilized, yet you fight like starving beasts. Your men injected themselves with chemicals to ignore fatal wounds. Your soldiers used blades when their guns ran dry. You bombed your own positions. Dalton offered a grim, humorless smile. You kicked in our front door and threatened our families. What did you expect? A polite debate. Before Kalar could answer, a shadow fell over the encampment. The daylight dimmed, as if a massive storm cloud had suddenly blotted out the local star. A low subsonic rumble vibrated through the earth, a frequency so deep it rattled the teeth in Kalar's skull. He looked up. The human medics stopped their work. The Tarkin prisoners murmured in sudden renewed terror. Breaking through the upper atmosphere of New Odessa were ships. They were not the blocky utilitarian dropships that had assaulted the camp. They were leviathans of dark gray metal, bristling with kinetic railguns, missile pods, and massive glowing engine nacelles. They eclipsed the sun. There were dozens of them, cruisers, destroyers, and at the center, a colossal supercarrier that defied the laws of orbital mechanics just by staying aloft. Emblazoned on its hull was the name UEA Washington. Kalar stared at the armada filling the sky, his mind failing to process the scale of the firepower descending upon the planet. Your reinforcements, Kalar whispered, a cold knot forming in his secondary stomach. You called your fleet. Major Dalton looked up at the Washington, his hands clasped behind his back. Yes, the United Earth Alliance Third Fleet. They just arrived from the Sirius sector. Slipspace travel takes time, you see. Kalar looked back at Dalton, a horrifying realization dawning on him. He thought back to the frantic, desperate fighting at the refinery, the suicide charge at the dam, the sheer, unadulterated struggle for every inch of dirt. If your fleet just arrived, Kalar started, his voice trembling. If your military might is only now entering the system, then who have we been fighting for the past week? Major Dalton looked at Kalar, and the empathy in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, hard pride. New Odessa is an agricultural colony, Sub-Commander, Dalton said softly. You haven't been fighting the military. You've been fighting the local farm guards, the planetary militia, and a single underfunded light infantry reserve regiment that was stranded here waiting for a transport ship. The breath left Kalar's lungs. 5,000 elite vanguard troops of the Tarkin Empire, their mechs, their plasma cannons, their orbital dreadnought. They had been bled dry, driven mad, and entirely dismantled by a handful of human farmers and a skeleton crew of reserve soldiers equipped with kinetic rifles and shotguns. The people you fought, Dalton continued, were fighting to protect their grain silos and water processors. They were fighting with limited ammo and surplus gear. He pointed up at the massive dreadnoughts eclipsing the sky. That up there, that is the real human military. That is the storm you invited. And I strongly suggest you tell your High Council to surrender before they decide to start shooting. The Tarkans did not go back to their homeworld as conquerors. They returned as messengers of their own inadequacy. Commander Vierne survived his wounds, saved by the very hands of the species he had tried to eradicate. He was placed in a human military prison, stripped of his rank, and put on trial for war crimes. Kaler, however, was chosen to act as the liaison for the armistice. He was escorted back to the Tarkin capital world of Kalen Prime by a human diplomatic envoy guarded by the very soldiers who had haunted his nightmares in the mud of New Odessa. When Kylar stood before the High Council, he did not speak of human frailty. He did not mention their soft skin or their reliance on chemical combustion. He showed them the footage of Sergeant David Miller, his body ripped open by plasma fire, smiling as he pulled the pin on a fragmentation grenade. He played the audio of the shrieking metallic noise that had driven their warriors to madness inside the Axiom. He laid out the medical logs detailing the effects of human adrenaline, the biological override that turned their fear into weaponized suicidal rage. And finally, he presented the images of the human medical camps where Tarkin wounded were treated with the exact same care and urgency as humanity's own. They are a paradox, High Council. Kalar declared, his voice echoing through the grand silicate halls of his ancestors. They possess the capacity for absolute unrestrained barbarism. If you push them, they will burn their own worlds just to ensure you burn with them. They will hunt you to the point of exhaustion. They will use the dark, the cold, and the dirt as their allies. They are persistence predators who view their own mortality not as a limitation, but as a tactical asset. The Grand Chamber was deathly silent. The elders of the Empire beings who had orchestrated the subjugation of 100 worlds looked upon the evidence with growing horror. But that is not why we must surrender, Kylar continued, pacing the center of the chamber. Brutality can be countered with brutality. Fire can be fought with fire. We must sign the treaty because of what happens when the fire goes out. Kalar pulled up the final image, Dr. Evelyn Reed, her uniform stained with blood, meticulously repairing the shattered armor of a Tarkin heavy gunner. They are capable of an empathy so profound it is terrifying, he said softly. A species that fights without restraint is dangerous, but a species that can turn its savagery off a species that will beat you to the brink of death and then gently carry you to a hospital bed is a species that cannot be broken. If we continue this war, we will not just lose our fleets. We will lose our understanding of what it means to be a warrior. The Treaty of Sirius was signed 30 cycles later. The Tarkin Empire ceded the Epsilon Eridani sector and paid heavy reparations. They withdrew their expeditionary forces, dismantled their forward operating bases, and retreated behind their borders. Some among the Tarkin people still grumbled about the treaty. They sat in their comfortable halls, sipping spiced wine, and talked about the superiority of Tarkin armor and the elegance of plasma weaponry. They called the humans fragile. They called them soft. But Kylar knew the truth. When he closed his eyes, he did not see the gleaming dreadnoughts of the human navy. He saw the muddy trenches of New Odessa. He saw the red glare of a flare illuminating the fog. He saw creatures of water and bone refusing to dye their eyes black with adrenaline, sprinting into the jaws of hell with jagged knives and spiteful smiles. They signed the treaty because they finally understood their place in the galaxy. The Tarkans were the armored, calculating beasts of the cosmos. But humanity was the immune system of the universe. And God help any disease that tried to infect their home. If viewers found their pulse pounding and their heart racing during Kaler's horrifying realization of humanity's true nature, they should hit that like button right now. This channel dives deep into the most intense, gritty, and thought-provoking sci-fi HFY stories on the internet, exploring what makes the human spirit absolutely unbreakable. Don't let this story end here. Share this video with a friend who loves military sci-fi, and make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another epic tale from the stars. Let us know in the comments what alien species should humanity face next.